We've been talking about building teams and communicating clearly for a while now. A few weeks ago, if you remember, I reviewed a book on how to scale people. Last week, we talked about how to interview people and the types of questions you get when checking references, which we know is notoriously very tricky exercise. Well, this week, I have on the CarCast right here a very special guest who I've been following for a while. He's got a podcast focused on communication excellence. He's a Stanford professor. He's interviewed some of the greatest in the field of communication, Dan Pink, Nancy Duarte, and many, many more. And this week, it's my turn to interview him. His new book is a book called Think Faster, Talk Smarter. I've got it here on Kindle. Also have it on audiobook. Just came out, and we're going to discuss all of that with him right here, right now. But before we do that, I got to remind you that if you're one of those busy data AI and analytics leaders, been watching me on LinkedIn or on YouTube, and you've not subscribed to the channel, you're missing out. And you're missing out because when you subscribe, every time I publish a video, you get an alert, so you get access to the latest best practices, the names of the people, the best people you should know and follow. So pause this video for a second, go down, subscribe, and let's come back to this. So now, assuming that you've done all this, let's dive right into the interview. Matt is a lecturer at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. He specializes in strategic communication, cognitive planning, and interpersonal communication. And before teaching, he was actually in the business of software. So he's got experience like many of us here. He is the host of Stanford GSB's podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smart. Matt, welcome to the CarCast.
Bruno, I am so excited to be here with you. I love sitting in my car and I love having conversations. Putting the two together is a great idea.
And you look great. You got the glasses. So thanks for doing that as well. All right. So I've got your book on the Kindle. Like I said, I also have it on audio. So I've been listening to your voice in preparing for today's CarCast. You have a great voice, by the way.
Thank you.
It's almost surreal to hear you here. So let's get right into it. And let's start at the top. You know, I discovered your work, I think, on a business trip. I was going to Australia, and you came with me to the trip. I listened to a bunch of your podcasts back to back, I think. Tell us about it. So how did it get started, and how does that connect with your work at Stanford?
Well, they're definitely connected together. So in December of 2019, the business school came to me and said, we're experimenting with a podcast. We'd like to do a podcast. We've never really done just a podcast dedicated as a podcast. They'd taken classes and edited them, and you could listen in. And they knew that communication was something that resonated. I did a talk that was recorded and put online on YouTube about communication called Think Fast, Talk Smart, and the talk did very well. And they said, we know there's an audience. Would you mind doing it? And I try to live my life by not saying no when an opportunity presents. I said, sure, let's explore it. And we put it together. We came out in January of 2020. As you recall, a few weeks after that happened, the world changed dramatically. And a lot of people started listening to podcasts. A lot of people were struggling with how do I communicate in this pandemic world? And there we were, ready to help people. So we've been doing it ever since. I love doing it. It's a lot of fun. And like you, I love learning, and I get an opportunity to talk to wonderful people.
And now you've got 112 episodes, I think. So it's really taken off quite nicely. And you published a book that's directly related from the work you've done in the podcast. What I love about the book, it's very structured, and I'm a fairly structured person. You got 6 steps to your methodology. The book's organized actually around those steps. So very easy to kind of follow. At the end of each section, you got this drill it, try it section, which really makes it easy for anyone to have your ideas and work through them. Tell us about the 6 steps. What are they? Why do they matter? And particularly, I guess, why in that order?
Sure. So the book is dedicated to a very specific communication problem that we all face, and that is speaking in the moment, as we are doing now. Most of us, when we think about communication, high stakes communication, we think about presentations, pitches, meetings we create agendas for. But if you think about it, and Bruno, I know you know this because we've talked about it, most of our communication happens in the moment. Somebody asks a question, asks for feedback. You have to introduce yourself, make small talk. So the book is targeted towards that. And this is a problem that the deans at the Stanford's Business School came to me with about 8 years ago. They said, our students who are amazingly bright and who actually know the answer are having trouble when a professor points at them and says, "What do you think?" That dreaded cold call. So I did a deep dive into the research and came up with the methodology that the book talks about. And we've been teaching our Stanford MBA students this methodology for 8 years now. In the first 3 weeks of their time on campus, they have an opportunity to learn this, and they're feeling better about it. And the professors are saying the responses are better. So the 6 steps are: first, when it comes to speaking in the moment, you have to manage anxiety. Anxiety looms large in all communication, but especially when you're put on the spot. I ask all of your watchers and listeners to think about the last time somebody put them on the spot and how they felt. It was probably nervous. After we deal with nervousness, we have to address other mindset issues. Many of us, when we speak, we want to do it right. We want to get it right. We want the right answer, the best feedback. We want to be the most interesting person doing small talk. And that actually puts a lot of pressure on us to do it well at all. For all of your listeners who know a lot about tech, it's essentially we're overtaxing our CPU. We are putting too much, we're forcing too much bandwidth to be dedicated to our review and evaluation of what we're saying rather than focus on what we're actually saying. So I like to say it's about connection, not perfection. There is no right way to speak, only better ways and worse ways. And then the third step is about seeing these situations not as threats, but as challenges. You know, Bruno, if I said, "Hey, I'm going to ask you questions after you give that pitch," you might get a little nervous and defensive, like, I really have to defend my position. I'd like people to see these situations as opportunities to connect, to expand, to learn. Step 4 is all about listening. You cannot communicate effectively without listening well. Most of us aren't good listeners. We listen just enough to get the gist of what somebody is saying, and then we start rehearsing, practicing, judging, evaluating. If I listen well, I can get the nuance of what's needed in the moment. I know you've talked about interviewing. If you're not listening intently, you might not hear the question behind the question that's really being asked. And then the last 2 steps are about message. So the first 4 about mindset, last 2 about message. We have to package up and structure our message well. As you said, structure is key. Our brains are wired to process information that is structured, not lists of information. We do very poorly with lists. And then the last step, and I know you'll like this one, it's called the F word of communication, not the naughty one: focus. Many people say much more than they need to. We need to be clear and concise. And I know it's ironic that I'm going on for a long time, and here I am ending with being clear and concise. But your message will be, you will take your message in much better if it is focused, clear, and concise. The last thing I'll say is we have to follow the advice of my mother. Tell the time, don't build the clock.
And you actually, in the book, you talk about your wife that taught you about the
Yeah.
minimal words that you use. So this idea of simplicity, I think, definitely resonated. Beyond the framework, you also give a lot of very practical advice, like holding a cup of water to calm down. That's what I'm throwing. Or even sucking on lozenges like these. I'm French, so these are French little cashews here. To help you with talking and avoiding slurring. You got some great messages too. I think one you learned from the military: bluff, bottom
Bottom line up front.
line
Yes.
up front. So that's really important. You got another one that I really like. I'd love for you to explain is boom. What is boom? I like the Legion of Boom for people that are from Seattle listening to us. But what do you mean by that acronym?
Right. So what you're talking a lot about, Bruno, is this notion of managing anxiety. And there are things that we can do to manage anxiety. So when I get nervous, I blush and I perspire, I sweat. And that's because I'm getting hot. Your heart's beating faster, your body's tensing up, your blood pressure goes up. It's like you're exercising, and that's why we blush and sweat. So we need to cool ourselves down. So holding something cold in the palms of your hand cools our body down. They're thermoregulators for our body. Just on a cold morning, I know you've probably held a warm cup of tea or coffee and felt it warms you up. So we're cooling ourselves down. Sucking on a lozenge or a mint, that will actually reactivate your salivary glands. When we get nervous, we get dry mouth. So by sucking on something before you speak, it will help. So I recommend everybody define what I call an anxiety management plan. Everyone is different. What works for everyone everyone is different. And with that anxiety management plan, I recommend that you create an acronym that's memorable to you. It doesn't have to be memorable to anybody. So in the book, I mention a few, and BOOM is one of them. My personal anxiety management plan is when I get nervous, I hold something cold. I take a deep belly breath because that slows down my heart rate. I make sure my exhale is twice as long as my inhale. I say a tongue twister. You can't say a tongue twister right and not be in the present moment. What gets me nervous is I'm worried about, will I be effective or not? So if I get present
Yeah.
oriented, I'm not worried about it. And then the final thing I do is I remind myself that I am in service of my audience. So I have value to bring. And that takes the spotlight off of me and puts it on somebody else. So I encourage everybody to create an anxiety management plan that works for them. BOOM is simply an acronym of somebody I coached. B stands for make sure that you are breathing, deep breathing. O has to do with making sure that you put the object of your attention not on yourself, but on the other person. The next O is all about obtaining as much information as you can about the environment and the audience. And then finally, the M is to take that mindset of when I feel anxiety, to greet it. Mindfulness teaches us that when you feel a negative emotion,
Yeah.
adopt it and go along with it rather than try to fight against it. So BOOM is just an acronym that helped that person remember. All of us have to come up with our own.
And it's a system for you. Can I ask you what the tongue twister is?
Only if you will say it after me. If you repeat it, I'll say it and then you say it.
I'll
One,
try.
I'll do
I'll
it one
try.
phrase at a time. The reason I like this tongue twister, Bruno, is if you say it wrong, you say a naughty word. So I'm going to be listening. All right. Repeat after
Okay.
me. I slit a sheet.
I slit a sheet.
A sheet I slit.
A sheet I slit.
And on that slitted sheet I sit.
And on that slitted sheet I slit. Oh my gosh, this is
Oh
really
yeah.
hard.
It's very hard.
Specifically for French people because we have a really hard time with the
Yeah.
dry sound of an E. So that you really
Yes.
got
Well,
me.
you made a little mistake, but your mistake was not the one most people make. Most people say shit when they say it wrong, and you did not do
Yeah.
that. But it's I slit a sheet I slit, and on that slitted sheet I sit. And I say that 3 times. I did it before you and I got on this call. It warms up my voice. It gets me present oriented.
Wow, that's amazing. All right, we talked about the first part of the book here. The second part of the book is about all applications of specific use cases. I mean, there's so much in the book. I like the analogy of mistakes, the giving yourself permission to making mistakes and failing, asking questions. I'm actually going to do a talk at the CIO Summit next week. I'm going to do that. I'm going to ask my audience questions, even though I'm the only one talking, just to keep it engaging, which is really great.
Right.
And then you've got this universal structure when you're just not expecting a question. Think about this idea of the what, the so what, the now what. There's a
Yes.
lot. Even the grandmother test is in there, right? So there's a lot of density, and you've prioritized in part two specific use cases, so now people can take all these learnings and apply them. So tell us, maybe we don't have time to cover all of them, but maybe one use case that you think is particularly useful, and why do you think it is?
Great question, and thank you for summarizing a lot of it. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to summarize a lot of the points you made and explain them as I use this notion of giving feedback. Feedback is critical. All of us, especially leaders, need to be able to give feedback well. I am a huge devotee and disciple of Kim Scott's Radical Candor. Kim
Yeah.
is a neighbor. I like her a lot, and I think her ideas on feedback are excellent. I have a structure that helps. So imagine we're in a situation, Bruno, where we come out of a meeting and you turn to me and say, hey, what do you think? In that moment, I have to come up with feedback. And that can be really hard because I have to think about all
Yeah.
the things that went well and didn't, but I also have to package it in a way that could be meaningful for you. So I have this structure. You called it the universal structure, which I agree. It's 3 questions: what, so what, now what? What is your idea? Your feedback, your position, your product. So what is, why is it important to the person I'm talking to? And now what is what comes next? In this case, what the feedback is you'd like. So I might say, Bruno, you did a great job in the meeting, except when you talked about the implementation plan. You were very quick and you didn't give a lot of detail. That's the what. When you speak quickly without a lot of detail, people might think you're not as prepared. That's the so what. Next time, I'd like you to slow down and add these 2 specific examples. That's the now what. So that structure helps me in the moment package up information. It's a recipe. And if I have a recipe, all I have to do is put the ingredients in, which is what I've thought. Now, you also mentioned the grandmother test. When we talk, we have to make sure that people understand what we're saying. My mother is in her 80s. She is a very smart, cognitively capable woman, but she doesn't know a lot of the technical terms and the acronyms that we all use. So we have to, it reminds me, and that's why I call it the grandma test, because I tell my kids this all the time, because my kids are always excited to talk to grandma about all the TikToks and all this. My mom has no idea what the hell they're talking about. So you have to define those terms for folks. So packaging it up in a structure like what, so what, now what, reminding yourself that I have to use language that is understandable to the people I'm talking about. That's what helps. And then you'll mention asking questions. That's incredibly important. When I give feedback, I have to check in to make sure you understood the feedback. Questioning is a way to engage your audience. So I hope by giving that example of feedback, people get a sense of what the rest of the book is about, but they also understand some of those ideas that you mentioned.
Oh, you've got a lot in the book. You remind me here, even of this curse of knowledge and even the curse of
Yes.
fashion, I think you call it, where sometimes
Yeah.
you you don't even realize that you're using jargon that is unique to you. I think the analogy you use, the example you use, is the GOAT, which
Yes.
which is an acronym that summarizes what does the GOAT mean? Actually, I'll let you
So,
tell that story.
I love that you brought up the curse of passion. Many of us, we are so passionate about what we do, we forget that the language we talk about it with is confusing to people. So I do a lot of work as a consultant all over the world, and I do some work for the military and the FBI. And I was on a military base, and I told somebody we have to be careful about the jargon and acronyms because nowhere in the world are there more acronyms than in the military. And this guy looked at me straight face, no smile, said, "We don't have that problem here. We have a GOAT for that." And I was like, "What do you mean a GOAT?" And he said, "No, we have a glossary of acronyms and terms." In other words, they took all their acronyms, put it in a document, and then gave it an acronym. That's how bad it was. And that was his point.
Yeah, that's just a hilarious example, I think. All right, well, we could talk for hours here, but I can't end without asking you the question that you ask everyone when you end your podcast. Matt, are you ready for this question? What are the first three ingredients that go into a successful communication recipe?
Well, I've never heard that question before.
It's a brilliant question, isn't it?
It's a brilliant question. Yes, thank you. So I would first start where I think we all need to start with, which is knowing our audience.
Yeah.
Many of us make the mistake of thinking, here are all the things I want to say. It's not about what you want to say. It's what does your audience need to hear. So you have to understand their needs. Once you understand that, the next thing you have to do is you have to have a clear goal. So it's audience goal. To me, a goal has three parts: information, emotion, and action. What do I want them to know? How do I want them to feel? What do I want them to do? So I think about my audience, I think about my goal, and then what we just talked about, you must have a structure. Don't just list information. Don't just rattle on and on. Be concise. So audience, goal, structure.
Outstanding. And I knew you were going to nail this one because after 112 episodes, I would guess that you picked up the patterns. Now, obviously, everybody should subscribe to your podcast, and we're going to put links to it in my blog down here. Where should people find you? Should they follow you on LinkedIn? Should they reach out to you?
Yes. So Stanford Continuing Studies, which is open to the community, anybody can take the classes. I co-teach a great class with a guy named Adam Tobin. It's a lot of fun. It's about this very topic. We teach anybody anywhere in the world. It's virtual. So we've had people all over the world take the class. So Stanford Continuing Studies, search for my name. You'll find the class. You can get in touch with me through mattabrahams.com. And just like you, I'm huge on LinkedIn, or I like to use LinkedIn a lot. Please find me and link in with me there.
This has been awesome, and I wish we could take more time to talk about this, but I hope everybody's going to follow you. I hope they all found this special CarCast useful. If you do, remember to subscribe, like, comment, and share with your friends. Matt, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Bruno. It was awesome.